The story of Esther truly begins with a moment of defiance, a moment that would shape the destiny of an entire people, set against the grandeur and strict hierarchy of the Persian Empire. King Xerxes I, ruler of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, had established a court filled with opulence, ceremony, and rigid rules of power. Within this court, his queen, Vashti, occupied a position of honor and influence, but even queens were not without limits. Their power was deeply intertwined with the whims of the king, court politics, and the expectation of absolute obedience. In the third year of Xerxes' reign, around 483 BCE, Xerxes hosted a magnificent feast that lasted 180 days for his nobles and officials. Following this, he held a separate 7-day banquet for all the citizens of Susa. These feasts were more than displays of wealth. They were demonstrations of power, political authority, and the ability to command loyalty across a vast and diverse empire. During these celebrations, the king, intoxicated with pride and self-importance, commanded Queen Vashti to appear before his guests and display her beauty. Vashti's refusal to obey this command, a decision rooted perhaps in personal dignity, perhaps in political caution, or perhaps in fear of humiliation before the court, was unprecedented. In the context of the Persian court, disobedience was dangerous. To refuse a king's order, even for a queen, was a challenge to the very structure of imperial authority. Xerxes' reaction was swift and severe. He consulted his advisors, trusted officials who understood the delicate balance of law, power, and social expectation. The advisors argued that Vashti's disobedience would set a dangerous precedent. If the queen, a figure meant to embody obedience and grace, could refuse the king without consequence, it would encourage other women in the empire to do the same. In a society where authority was absolute and the social hierarchy rigidly maintained, this was seen not as a personal affront, but as a threat to order. They recommended that Vashti be removed from her position as queen. Her removal would serve as a warning and reinforce the king's authority, not only within his palace, but across the empire. Xerxes, convinced by this counsel, decreed that Vashti be deposed and that her royal position be filled by someone who would both please him and, by extension, serve the political interests of the empire. This moment, while brief in the narrative, is pivotal. Vashti's defiance illuminates the precarious position of women in royal courts, where influence was possible but always dependent on male approval, and where a single decision could mean either survival or erasure from history. It also establishes the environment into which Esther, a young Jewish woman, would soon enter, a world of political intrigue, high stakes, and life-or-death consequences. The removal of Vashti created a vacuum, not just in the queenly role, but in the symbolic representation of order and obedience in the Persian court. Xerxes' decision to hold a contest to select a new queen reflects both the personal nature of monarchical power and the cultural norms of the time. Women from across the empire, particularly those who could meet the court's stringent standards of beauty, demeanor, and loyalty, were brought to Susa for a rigorous preparation process. This process could last up to a year, involving training in etiquette, grooming, and the arts of palace life. It was not simply a matter of physical appearance, but also an assessment of adaptability, discretion, and the ability to navigate court politics. Within this environment, Vashti's story casts a long shadow. Her refusal to comply, whether interpreted as courage, pride, or a moral stance, set a precedent that rippled through the court. It demonstrated the potential for individual agency, even in a system designed to limit it. For the Jewish community in Susa, who were living as exiles under the Persian Empire, this moment would indirectly shape their future. The removal of Vashti opened the door for Esther, another woman whose identity and position would intersect with the political and social currents of the empire in profound ways. Scholars examining the historical context note that while the story of Vashti cannot be verified outside the biblical text, the dynamics it presents are entirely consistent with what is known about Persian court life. Royal women wielded influence behind the scenes, but were always vulnerable to the king's authority. Court officials played crucial roles as intermediaries and advisors, and the careful maintenance of order and protocol was essential to prevent disorder in an empire that spanned continents and contained countless cultures and peoples. The grandeur of Xerxes' feast, lasting months, was not merely ceremonial. It reflected the empire's wealth, the sophistication of its administration, and the logistical capacity to mobilize resources and people from across vast territories. Hosting such events demonstrated the king's ability to govern, control, and impress upon both nobles and commoners the magnitude of his power. Within this setting, the stakes for every participant were immense. A single misstep could mean death or disgrace, while a carefully executed gesture could lead to favor, promotion, or influence. Vashti's refusal, therefore, was not a minor domestic dispute. It was a disruption in the delicate equilibrium of power that held the Persian court together. Her removal, while justified in the eyes of the king and his counselors, also illustrates the vulnerability of women whose authority was contingent upon male approval. This context helps us understand why Esther's eventual rise was both possible and extraordinary. In the wake of Vashti's removal, the Persian court sought not only a new queen, but also a woman whose presence would reinforce the king's authority and project stability across the empire. This selection process would bring Esther, a young Jewish woman whose background included exile, cultural displacement, and the necessity of navigating a foreign court, into the center of one of history's most famous narratives. Vashti's defiance, while it may appear as a simple act of refusal, reverberates through the story, setting the tone for a narrative in which the choices, courage, and agency of individual women have far-reaching consequences. It also underscores the environment of the Persian Empire, a place of vast wealth, complex politics, and rigid social hierarchies where power was both visible and hidden, formal and personal. Without grasping the stakes of courtly life, the significance of obedience and defiance, and the delicate balance of authority, one cannot fully comprehend the risks Esther would later take and the profound impact her actions would have. In essence, the events surrounding Queen Vashti are not merely an introduction to the story. They are a lens through which we can understand the world of the Persian Empire. They reveal the intersections of power, gender, and social order that defined life in one of history's most expansive and diverse empires. They also highlight the precarious position of minority communities, like the Jews in Susa, who had to navigate both survival and cultural preservation in a complex political landscape. As we transition to the next stage of the narrative, Vashti's story reminds us that history is shaped not only by kings and generals, but also by those whose choices, whether acts of courage, defiance, or necessity, ripple outward to alter the course of events for countless others. After the removal of Queen Vashti, the Persian Empire was left with a vacancy in the highest female position of the land, a void that would set the stage for one of the most remarkable ascents in biblical history. The search for a new queen was not merely about replacing a position. It was a calculated political move by King Xerxes to reinforce his authority, display the wealth and power of the empire, and maintain the delicate balance within the court. In 483 BCE, Xerxes issued a decree throughout his vast empire, calling for beautiful young women to be brought to the royal palace at Susa. These women were to undergo a year-long preparation process to become suitable candidates for queenship. This process was meticulous and demanding, reflecting the Persian court's obsession with perfection, decorum, and the projection of imperial power. Young women from various provinces, each carrying different cultural backgrounds, languages, and traditions, were gathered and placed under the care of Haggai, the king's custodian of women. Hagai's responsibility was to oversee their training, including grooming, diet, language instruction, and the subtle arts of courtly behavior and charm. Each woman was given cosmetics, oils, and adornments appropriate for her preparation, ensuring that by the time she met the king, she embodied both physical beauty and courtly sophistication. Among these young women was Esther, known by her Hebrew name Hadassah. She was an orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai after her parents had passed away. Esther's family background was one of displacement and survival. As Jews living in exile, they carried the memory of the Babylonian conquest and the subsequent journey into Persian lands. Her story is remarkable because it illustrates how individuals from marginalized communities, far from centers of power, could navigate the complexities of empire and rise to positions of influence. Esther's selection for queenship was not an accident of beauty alone. It reflected her intelligence, poise, and ability to adapt to the foreign customs of the Persian court. In a palace where personal safety and favor were contingent upon winning the king's attention and approval, Esther's success in attracting Xerxes' notice was both extraordinary and historically significant in terms of narrative symbolism. While historians debate the factual accuracy of the Book of Esther, the story's setting and processes are consistent with what is known about the Persian Empire. Royal women underwent extensive training and preparation, and their roles were deeply tied to political and social expectations. In this environment, Esther's rise demonstrates how personal qualities could intersect with opportunity, producing outcomes that altered the course of events within the empire. The narrative emphasizes that Esther kept her Jewish identity a secret at Mordecai's advice, understanding the potential dangers in revealing it within a court that did not share her cultural or religious background. This strategic discretion highlights her intelligence and foresight. Her identity would later become a critical element in the survival of the Jewish people, demonstrating that her decisions were informed not only by self-preservation, but by concern for her community. As Esther completed her preparation and was presented to King Xerxes, the king found favor in her eyes. The moment of selection was a culmination of many elements: her personal qualities, her careful adherence to courtly training, and perhaps the providential alignment of circumstances that allowed her to stand out among hundreds of candidates. The choice of Esther as queen illustrates a critical aspect of Persian court politics. The king's favor was the ultimate arbiter of power and influence. Yet, beneath this personal choice lay the broader mechanisms of empire, where the selection of a queen could have implications for court alliances, social stability, and perceptions of authority. Esther's position as queen elevated her not only in terms of social status, but also in political significance. Queens in the Persian court, though subordinate to the king in public authority, wielded influence behind the scenes. Their counsel could affect decisions, their presence could sway public perception, and their ability to navigate court factions was essential to survival. Beyond the personal, Esther's selection reflects broader societal structures. The Persian Empire was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious entity, where loyalty to the king and adherence to imperial norms were paramount. By bringing women from across the empire to Susa, the court not only ensured a pool of candidates for queenship, but also demonstrated the empire's capacity to mobilize and control resources, enforce social hierarchies, and maintain cohesion across vast distances. Within this context, Esther's rise to queenhood can be seen as a microcosm of how personal agency interacts with systemic structures. Her intelligence, adaptability, and strategic choices allowed her to navigate a complex court environment, positioning her to later influence events of great consequence. The narrative emphasizes that Esther's beauty alone was insufficient. Her wisdom, discretion, and moral compass were equally vital. These qualities would later define her legacy, illustrating that leadership and influence often depend on a combination of personal virtues and situational awareness. As Esther assumed her role as queen, she entered a world where every gesture, word, and decision was scrutinized. The Persian court was not merely a residence. It was a center of power, intrigue, and constant negotiation. Understanding this environment is crucial to appreciating the courage and foresight Esther would demonstrate in the events that followed. Her ascent is a story not just of personal triumph, but of strategic positioning within a complex and often perilous political system. It shows how an individual, even from a vulnerable or marginalized position, could become central to the fate of an entire people. In this period of history, roughly the mid-5th century BCE, the Persian Empire was managing the challenges of governance across a vast territory, balancing military campaigns, provincial administration, and the integration of diverse cultures. The court at Susa was both a symbol of imperial strength and a microcosm of the empire's internal dynamics. Within this intricate system, Esther's story unfolds, illustrating the tension between personal agency and systemic authority, between cultural identity and assimilation, and between survival and moral responsibility. The Book of Esther captures these dynamics with remarkable narrative skill, portraying not only the rise of a young Jewish woman to queenship, but also the broader implications for her people and the empire. Her story is a testament to how individual courage, intelligence, and strategic thinking can intersect with historical forces to produce enduring impact. By understanding the historical and cultural context of Esther's selection as queen, we gain insight into the Persian Empire's social and political structures, the challenges faced by minority communities, and the qualities required for individuals to navigate complex environments successfully. Esther's rise serves as a foundation for the events that follow, where her position, identity, and wisdom will become instrumental in shaping the destiny of the Jewish people in Persia. Once Esther had been chosen as queen, her life was far from safe or predictable. Behind the silk curtains and golden halls of Susa, the Persian court thrummed with intrigue, rivalry, and constant vigilance. In this world, loyalty was both essential and perilous. Mordecai, Esther's cousin and guardian, occupied a position that placed him at the heart of the empire's political pulse. He sat at the king's gate, a location that functioned as both a governmental checkpoint and a center for official communication. In this role, Mordecai had access to important information and observed the subtle dynamics of power that unfolded daily in the corridors of the palace. It was here at the king's gate that he would uncover a plot that would not only demonstrate his personal loyalty, but also set a precedent for the themes of justice, vigilance, and moral responsibility that run through the Book of Esther. Two of King Xerxes' eunuchs, charged with guarding the king's chambers, had conspired to assassinate him. In the Persian court, plots against the king were not uncommon. A ruler's authority, though immense, was constantly under threat from ambitious courtiers, provincial governors, or palace servants. Xerxes' empire, spanning hundreds of thousands of square miles, required constant vigilance to maintain control, and the palace itself was a hotbed of political maneuvering. Mordecai's discovery of the plot was crucial. Unlike many who might have remained silent for fear of reprisal, he took action. His first step was to alert Esther, who, by virtue of her position as queen, had access to the king. Mordecai's decision to inform Esther highlights a key theme in the narrative: the interplay between duty, loyalty, and strategic action. He trusted that Esther, though young and newly positioned, could navigate the delicate channels of palace protocol to ensure that justice was served. Esther, understanding both the gravity of the situation and the risks involved, conveyed the information to King Xerxes. This act was not without danger. Approaching the king without being summoned could have resulted in immediate execution. Persian law allowed the king to execute anyone who entered his presence without permission, yet Esther chose to risk her life, demonstrating her courage, discretion, and moral awareness. Upon learning of the conspiracy, Xerxes ordered an investigation. The culprits were caught and executed, and the records of Mordecai's loyalty were entered into the royal chronicles. This moment is significant not only within the narrative, but also within the broader context of Persian administration. The empire's bureaucratic system meticulously recorded acts of service, which could later influence appointments, honors, or political decisions. Mordecai's recognition in the royal chronicles, therefore, established a foundation that would prove crucial in later events. While historians cannot independently verify the details of this plot, the story aligns with what is known about Persian court life. The empire relied heavily on a network of officials, advisors, and guards, and information about threats to the king would have been vital. Loyalty was highly valued, and those who demonstrated it could gain influence and protection, though always within the precarious bounds of imperial favor. The narrative also underscores the moral dimensions of loyalty. Mordecai's actions were not motivated by ambition alone. They reflected a commitment to justice and to the well-being of the king and, indirectly, the empire itself. Furthermore, Mordecai's loyalty emphasizes the interconnectedness of individual decisions and larger historical outcomes. By acting decisively, he not only prevented the king's assassination, but also positioned himself and Esther to influence events that would affect the entire Jewish community in Persia. The story of the palace plot also illustrates the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals within the empire. Xerxes, despite his authority, depended on the vigilance and integrity of his subordinates. This dependence highlights the delicate balance of power in large empires. Central authority was immense, yet effective governance required trust, loyalty, and the careful management of information. Esther's role in transmitting the warning adds another layer to the narrative. Her willingness to intervene on behalf of Mordecai demonstrates her awareness of her responsibilities as queen. Though young and new to the court, she understood that her position conferred both influence and obligation. The story emphasizes her prudence, courage, and strategic thinking, qualities that would later define her pivotal actions against Haman's plot. The execution of the conspirators also reflects the Persian emphasis on justice and order. In an empire as vast as Xerxes, maintaining internal security was crucial. Punishments for treason and assassination attempts were severe and public, serving both as retribution and as deterrence. These measures ensured that loyalty was rewarded and betrayal met with swift consequences. Within this framework, Mordecai's actions can be seen as both morally right and politically advantageous. His recognition in the royal chronicles was more than a personal honor. It represented a formal acknowledgement of his integrity, service, and the role he played in safeguarding the king. Scholars analyzing this segment of the Esther narrative note that it emphasizes the importance of record-keeping and administration in the Persian Empire. Royal chronicles were not merely historical records. They were tools of governance that could influence appointments, legal decisions, and the distribution of honors. Mordecai's presence in these records would later become a key factor in the reversal of Haman's plot. Beyond the immediate political and administrative implications, the discovery of the palace plot introduces a recurring motif in the Esther story: the idea that careful observation, ethical action, and strategic communication can shape historical outcomes. Mordecai's vigilance, combined with Esther's willingness to act, demonstrates the impact that individuals can have within the larger currents of empire. The narrative also provides insight into the role of women in the Persian court. While queens were often expected to be ornamental and obedient, Esther's intervention illustrates how they could exercise influence indirectly, using their proximity to the king to effect significant change. This subtle yet powerful form of agency is central to understanding her character and the narrative as a whole. Moreover, the story of Mordecai's loyalty reinforces themes of justice and responsibility that resonate beyond the palace walls. It serves as a reminder that actions guided by principle, even in the face of personal risk, can have far-reaching consequences. This principle would later underpin Esther's own decisions and the survival of the Jewish community in Persia. The palace plot also highlights the tension between secrecy and disclosure. In an environment where information was a form of power, knowing when and how to reveal critical knowledge was essential. Mordecai's decision to inform Esther and Esther's choice to convey it to the king exemplify strategic judgment within a high-stakes political context. This interplay between discretion and action is a recurring theme in the narrative, emphasizing that the survival and success of individuals and communities often depended on timing, prudence, and courage. Finally, the episode underscores the precariousness of life within the Persian court. Even the most loyal subjects had to navigate a world of surveillance, rumor, and shifting alliances. Every decision carried potential consequences, and survival often required a blend of intelligence, moral clarity, and opportunism. Mordecai's loyalty, Esther's intervention, and the resulting execution of the conspirators set the stage for the later, more dramatic conflicts with Haman. They establish a pattern. Vigilance, courage, and ethical action can influence events in ways that extend far beyond the immediate moment. They also remind us that history is shaped not only by kings and generals, but by those who act with integrity within systems of power, often at great personal risk. As we move forward into the narrative of Haman's rise and the threat to the Jews, the palace plot serves as a critical foundation. It illustrates the stakes of courtly life, the importance of loyalty and moral action, and the intricate web of cause and effect that defines historical events. Mordecai's recognition, recorded in the royal chronicles, will later become a key instrument in the reversal of fortune that ensures the survival of the Jewish people in Persia, showing that acts of courage and righteousness can resonate across time and circumstance, shaping the destiny of entire communities. After Mordecai's loyalty was recognized, the story of the Persian court continues, but peace in Susa is short-lived. The stage is now set for one of the most dramatic and dangerous figures in the Book of Esther, Haman, a high-ranking official in King Xerxes' court. Haman, an Agagite by heritage, held a position of immense influence. He was appointed by Xerxes to a role that gave him authority over the nobles and officials throughout the empire. In the Persian court, titles and ranks were not mere formalities. They conferred real power over administration, taxation, and the implementation of the king's policies. Haman, by virtue of his position, was able to influence decisions that affected thousands of people. However, Haman's rise to power was also accompanied by arrogance and pride. When Mordecai, who had previously uncovered the plot against the king, refused to bow to him, Haman's personal animosity was ignited. In the Persian court, respect and deference to superiors were essential, and Mordecai's refusal was seen as both a personal affront and a challenge to Haman's authority. But the conflict was deeper than mere personal insult. Mordecai's Jewish faith was central to his identity, and bowing to Haman would have violated his religious principles. This act of defiance, though small in the moment, triggered a chain of events that would threaten the entire Jewish population in Persia. Haman's anger was not limited to Mordecai alone. In his rage, he devised a plan to exterminate all Jews in the Persian Empire, seeing their survival and presence as a threat to his honor and authority. He approached King Xerxes with a proposition to issue a royal decree authorizing the destruction, killing, and annihilation of all Jews on a single day across all provinces. Haman justified this plan to the king by portraying the Jews as a distinct people with customs and laws different from the rest of the empire, suggesting that they could not be fully loyal subjects. Xerxes, either persuaded by Haman or indifferent to the consequences, agreed and sealed the decree with the king's ring, formalizing the order across the empire. Haman used a lottery system, casting per to determine the exact date for the annihilation of the Jews. This is the origin of the festival of Purim, a commemoration of the Jewish people's survival centuries later. The decree sent throughout the empire was unprecedented in scale. It reflected both the administrative efficiency of the Persian Empire and the vulnerability of minority communities within it. Letters and messages traveled swiftly along the empire's extensive communication network, ensuring that every province received the command. For the Jewish community, this decree represented an existential threat. Unlike previous episodes of persecution, this was a planned and coordinated attempt at total annihilation. The Jews in Susa and elsewhere would soon learn that survival would depend not on the mercy of kings alone, but on courage, strategy, and unity. While historians debate the literal historicity of Haman's plot and the identity of the Agagites, the narrative captures a historically plausible tension within empires, the friction between powerful officials and minority communities. Persian emperors often relied on bureaucrats to manage vast territories, and these officials could exercise significant authority, sometimes to the detriment of certain groups. Haman's plot reflects the precarious position of minorities in imperial societies, illustrating how the ambitions and prejudices of a single powerful individual could endanger entire populations. Within the story, the threat posed by Haman also underscores the themes of fate and providence. Mordecai's earlier loyalty to the king, recorded in the royal chronicles, would later become a vital instrument in countering Haman's plan. This demonstrates the narrative principle that actions taken with integrity and foresight can have long-lasting consequences, even when the immediate situation seems hopeless. The narrative tension intensifies as the Jewish community grapples with the reality of the decree. The Book of Esther describes the people's grief, fasting, and mourning upon hearing that their lives were at risk. For Jews in exile, the story would resonate deeply. They were already living in a foreign land and now faced a decree that sought to erase their presence. This moment highlights the vulnerability of displaced peoples in imperial contexts, where survival often depended on both diplomacy and internal solidarity. Haman's rise and the threat he posed also offer insight into the mechanisms of power within the Persian Empire. Officials who held the king's trust could propose sweeping decrees, and the emperor's authority was such that these decrees were enforceable across continents. This centralized power structure allowed for efficient governance, but also enabled abuses by ambitious individuals. Haman's plot, while extreme in the narrative, illustrates how unchecked authority could create existential risks for certain groups. The psychological impact of the decree is central to the narrative. The Jews are confronted with the possibility of extinction, forcing key figures like Mordecai and Esther to consider bold, risky strategies. The story emphasizes that survival is not guaranteed by the king's authority alone, but depends on the moral courage and strategic action of individuals who understand the stakes and are willing to act decisively. This scenario also illuminates the nature of Haman's character. He embodies the dangers of arrogance, unchecked power, and personal vendetta. His ambition is fueled by pride, resentment, and a desire to impose his will over others. Historically, court officials often wielded influence far beyond their formal titles, and Haman's behavior fits within the broader patterns of bureaucratic power and personal ambition in ancient empires. While modern historians cannot confirm the events as described, they acknowledge that minority populations in large empires often face systemic risks and could be vulnerable to the whims of influential individuals. The narrative uses Haman's threat to highlight the stakes of political and social vulnerability, illustrating that in an empire as vast and diverse as Persia, loyalty, identity, and strategy were all matters of survival. Haman's plot also introduces an element of suspense that drives the story forward. By casting lots to determine the date of destruction, he formalizes the threat, creating a sense of inevitability and tension. This device heightens the drama while also emphasizing the calculated and bureaucratic nature of his plan. It is not impulsive. It is systematic and thorough, reflecting the efficiency of the Persian administrative system while amplifying the peril faced by the Jews. The narrative, while focused on Haman's malevolence, also sets up the moral and strategic challenges for Esther. The queen's wisdom, courage, and ability to influence the king would soon become essential. Haman's decree transforms the story from one of personal ambition to one of communal survival, making the stakes higher and the eventual resolution more dramatic. Beyond the immediate plot, Haman's rise and the decree underscore larger historical and cultural themes. They reflect the precariousness of minority existence in empires, how power can be concentrated in the hands of individuals, and the moral and ethical choices that determine survival. Mordecai's and Esther's responses to this crisis later serve as case studies in leadership, courage, and the strategic use of influence within hierarchical societies. The story of Haman, while debated by historians in terms of factual accuracy, conveys universal lessons about the consequences of hatred, pride, and the abuse of authority. It also demonstrates how vigilance, ethical action, and strategic intervention can counter seemingly insurmountable threats. The moment of truth had arrived. Esther, a young Jewish queen who had ascended from obscurity to the heart of the Persian Empire, faced a decision that would define not only her own destiny, but the fate of an entire people. The decree issued by Haman, calling for the annihilation of the Jews across all provinces of Xerxes' empire, had thrown the Jewish community into despair. Mourning, fasting, and prayer became the immediate response, but the ultimate resolution rested in Esther's hands. The Persian court was a place of unimaginable opulence, yet beneath the gilded walls, it was a world of danger, intrigue, and rigid hierarchies. Queens could wield influence, but they did so through delicate navigation of protocols and careful counsel. To approach King Xerxes without being summoned was strictly forbidden and could result in immediate execution. Even the queen herself, elevated in rank and privilege, was subject to the absolute authority of the king. In the face of this risk, Esther demonstrated extraordinary courage. She prepared herself mentally, spiritually, and strategically. She instructed Mordecai to gather the Jews of Susa to fast for 3 days on her behalf, asking them to refrain from food and water while seeking divine guidance and protection. This collective act of fasting symbolized unity, hope, and the seriousness of the task at hand. It also reflects the historical reality of exiled Jewish communities maintaining their cultural and religious practices while living under foreign rulers. Fasting and prayer were means of asserting identity and seeking moral and spiritual strength in times of crisis. With the support of her people, Esther resolved to approach the king uninvited. Her plan required not just courage but careful calculation. She understood that appealing to Xerxes would necessitate timing, tact, and a strategy that would draw his favor without provoking his anger. The Persian court, while centralized and hierarchical, operated on personal influence and persuasion as much as official decrees. Queens who could navigate these informal channels of power often determined the outcomes of crucial events. Esther's approach was marked by humility, wisdom, and the use of her unique position. She prepared a series of banquets, not as mere displays of wealth or celebration, but as strategic meetings to gain the king's attention and trust. These banquets allowed her to present her case in a controlled environment, to appeal to Xerxes personally, and to create a context in which her revelations would be heard and taken seriously. The narrative emphasizes Esther's intelligence and patience. She did not rush or confront the king immediately. Instead, she created a scenario in which her voice could carry weight, using her proximity to the king to influence decisions that would otherwise be impossible for a woman, particularly a minority woman, in a male-dominated empire. Historical analysis of the Persian court suggests that informal influence and personal relationships were crucial. Official decrees and written communications were only one part of governance. Persuasion, loyalty, and personal favor were equally important. Esther's actions reflect an acute understanding of these dynamics, demonstrating strategic thinking that aligned personal courage with political necessity. At the first banquet, Esther invited Xerxes and Haman to a meal, establishing a private and controlled setting. By doing so, she ensured that the king's attention would be focused entirely on her, providing a moment to reveal the critical information about Haman's plot. Haman, unaware of Esther's identity and intentions, likely assumed the banquet was in his honor, further illustrating the dramatic tension and strategic advantage Esther had created. The approach to the king was risky, but it was necessary. Confronting Haman's scheme indirectly through persuasion rather than confrontation reduced the likelihood of immediate rejection or punishment. The narrative portrays Esther as both courageous and calculating, recognizing that survival and success depended on understanding the king's character, the social dynamics of the court, and the political stakes. During the banquets, Esther gradually revealed her identity as a Jew and disclosed the existential threat posed by Haman's decree. She framed the conversation in a manner that highlighted the injustice and the personal consequences of the plot, appealing to Xerxes' sense of morality, responsibility, and the human cost of Haman's actions. Her revelations were not mere accusations. They were carefully constructed arguments that combined ethical, emotional, and strategic appeals. The historical plausibility of this scenario is supported by the structure of Persian governance, where officials and the king's inner circle had to negotiate loyalty, obedience, and influence. Queens who could communicate effectively with the king and leverage their proximity to power could alter decisions that affected entire populations. Esther's intervention demonstrates this dynamic in action. As Esther presented her case, Xerxes' attention shifted from Haman's authority to the moral and political implications of the decree. The king, confronted with the evidence of Haman's malevolence and the direct appeal of his queen, experienced a reversal in perspective. Haman's position, previously secure and influential, became precarious. The narrative illustrates how strategic action, combined with moral courage and careful timing, can overturn entrenched power structures, even within one of the largest empires in history. The story emphasizes that Esther's success was not a result of brute force or external power, but of intelligence, preparation, and ethical action. She used her role, her identity, and her understanding of court dynamics to intervene decisively. This reflects a broader historical truth. In hierarchical societies, those who understand and navigate informal structures of power often achieve outcomes that appear improbable or extraordinary. Beyond the immediate palace intrigue, Esther's intervention carries broader implications for her community. The Jewish people, previously facing annihilation, were now positioned for survival. The narrative highlights the importance of advocacy, courage, and the willingness to act on behalf of others, demonstrating that individual agency can have profound consequences for collective destiny. Esther's strategy also involved patience and timing. She did not immediately expose Haman or demand his punishment. Instead, she created a situation in which the king's perception of Haman's threat and ambition would naturally lead to his downfall. This approach minimized confrontation and maximized the likelihood of success, illustrating sophisticated political and psychological insight. Historians and scholars analyzing the story note that while the exact historical events cannot be independently verified, the scenario is consistent with what is known about Persian court practices. Influence, persuasion, and proximity to the king were key factors in decision-making. Esther's ability to navigate these factors underscores her intelligence and strategic thinking. The banquets also serve a symbolic function within the narrative. They represent the stages of negotiation, preparation, and revelation that define successful intervention in high-stakes political environments. They allow the audience to appreciate the tension, risk, and careful planning involved in Esther's actions. Moreover, they highlight the human dimensions of leadership, courage, empathy, foresight, and the moral imperative to act. In the Persian Empire, the stakes could not have been higher. Haman's authority, derived from the king's favor and bureaucratic position, allowed him to issue a decree that endangered lives across thousands of miles of territory. Esther's intervention demonstrates that even within such centralized and hierarchical systems, individual action could alter outcomes dramatically. Her courage was amplified by the collective support of her community, exemplified through fasting and moral encouragement, showing that successful intervention often combines personal initiative with communal solidarity. The story also reflects broader themes of identity, loyalty, and survival. Esther's Jewish heritage, initially concealed for safety, became a crucial aspect of her advocacy. Her willingness to reveal her identity, despite the personal risk, exemplifies the interplay between personal integrity and strategic action. This moment illustrates how identity can be both a source of vulnerability and a foundation for moral authority. By approaching the king strategically and courageously, Esther shifted the balance of power in the court. Haman's position, previously dominant, was challenged, setting in motion the events that would ultimately lead to his downfall and the preservation of the Jewish people. The narrative underscores the idea that effective action in high-stakes environments depends on preparation, understanding of power structures, courage, and the ability to act decisively when the moment arises. Esther's intervention is not only a story of personal bravery, but also a demonstration of leadership, diplomacy, and moral responsibility within a complex and dangerous imperial system. Her actions, though situated in the Persian Empire over 2,000 years ago, resonate as lessons in courage, strategy, and ethical leadership, illustrating that the decisions of individuals can have enduring consequences for communities and history itself. This moment of intervention, while tense and perilous, marks the turning point in the narrative. It shows that even in the face of systemic threats and overwhelming odds, careful planning, moral courage, and strategic action can redirect the course of events, ensuring survival and justice. The tension in the Persian court had reached its peak. Haman, once the most powerful man in Xerxes' empire after the king himself, now faced a situation he could not control. His arrogance, ambition, and hatred toward Mordecai and the Jewish people had blinded him to the vulnerabilities of his own position. While he had orchestrated a decree calling for the annihilation of the Jews, he underestimated the courage, intelligence, and strategic planning of Queen Esther. In the Persian court, power was often precarious. A single misstep could reverse fortunes overnight, and Haman's rise had been built on the favor of the king, a favor that could be withdrawn as swiftly as it was granted. The story of Haman's exposure begins with Esther's careful preparation. After inviting King Xerxes and Haman to a second banquet, Esther revealed the full extent of Haman's plot. She disclosed her identity as a Jew and explained the imminent threat to her people. The banquet, a seemingly ordinary setting, became the stage for an extraordinary confrontation. By using subtlety, patience, and timing, Esther ensured that her revelation carried maximum impact. Haman, who had expected honor and celebration, found himself in a position of vulnerability. His carefully constructed plan to destroy the Jews was now at risk, as the king was confronted directly with the implications of his advisor's actions. The Persian court's dynamics were such that personal appeal and proximity to the king could be decisive. Xerxes, confronted by the moral and political weight of the situation, acted decisively. The king's wrath, directed at Haman, was immediate and severe. Haman was seized and executed on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. a poetic reversal that underscores the themes of justice and fate woven throughout the narrative. This dramatic reversal highlights the fragility of power in hierarchical societies. Those who rise through ambition and manipulation may find their fortunes overturned by unforeseen events, moral intervention, or the strategic actions of those they underestimate. Haman's downfall illustrates the principle that unchecked authority, when combined with malice and arrogance, is inherently unstable. The exposure of Haman also reflects broader historical realities of Persian governance. Officials relied on the king's favor for their authority, and the centralization of power meant that falling out of favor could have immediate and fatal consequences. Haman's execution was not just personal retribution, it was a reinforcement of the king's authority, demonstrating that even the most influential courtiers were accountable to the monarch. Moreover, this episode demonstrates the strategic genius of Esther. By appealing to the king personally, using a combination of ethical argument, emotional resonance, and calculated timing, she transformed a personal risk into a historic triumph. Her ability to navigate the complexities of courtly politics illustrates how individuals could exert influence within highly hierarchical and centralized imperial systems. The story also emphasizes the role of written records and formal decrees in consolidating justice and authority. Haman's plot had been recorded and authorized by the king, but the reversal of his plan required swift bureaucratic action. Xerxes issued a new decree empowering the Jews to defend themselves, ensuring that the prior threat was nullified and that justice was executed. This bureaucratic efficiency, characteristic of the Persian Empire, allowed rapid enforcement across vast distances, demonstrating the empire's capacity to implement both destructive and corrective measures effectively. Beyond the immediate consequences for Haman, his exposure had profound implications for the Jewish community. The reversal of fortune shifted the balance of power, transforming despair into hope and vulnerability into security. This moment underscores the narrative's central theme, that courage, strategy, and ethical action can overcome systemic threats, even when they appear overwhelming. Historically, the story of Haman serves as a powerful illustration of the risks faced by minority communities in imperial contexts. While the literal details may be debated, the narrative captures the precariousness of Jewish life under foreign rule and the potential for individual agency to influence survival. Mordecai's earlier actions, his loyalty to the king, and his recognition in the royal chronicles became instrumental in enabling Esther's intervention and the eventual exposure of Haman. This interplay of loyalty, recognition, and strategic action highlights the interconnectedness of events and decisions within complex political systems. The narrative also emphasizes moral accountability. Haman's fate is not presented as a simple act of revenge, but as the natural consequence of his arrogance, prejudice, and abuse of power. The story conveys a broader lesson about leadership, ethics, and justice. Those who wield power must do so responsibly or face inevitable consequences. For the Persian court, Haman's execution reinforced the king's authority while signaling to all officials that loyalty, integrity, and adherence to ethical norms were critical to survival. It also demonstrated the potential of queens and other influential figures to intervene effectively when guided by wisdom and courage. The exposure of Haman and the reversal of his plans highlight a critical narrative device, the triumph of the marginalized through strategic intelligence and moral courage. Esther's actions, combined with Mordecai's loyalty, illustrate that influence is not solely a function of formal rank, but also of preparation, foresight, and ethical decision-making. The story teaches that individual action can alter the course of events within empires, even when systemic forces appear insurmountable. Furthermore, this segment reflects the cultural and religious significance of the narrative. Haman's threat and subsequent downfall are central to the origin of Purim, the festival celebrating Jewish survival and resilience. The story connects moral, strategic, and cultural dimensions, offering lessons in leadership, courage, and communal solidarity that resonate across generations. Within the broader historical context of the Persian Empire, Haman's rise and fall illustrate the complexities of court life. Ambition, personal enmity, and the abuse of administrative power could endanger entire populations, but these same structures also allowed for swift correction when wisdom and courage were exercised effectively. The narrative demonstrates the delicate balance of authority, the interplay of personal relationships and formal decrees, and the potential for extraordinary outcomes arising from seemingly ordinary individuals. The psychological tension in the story is also notable. Haman, confident in his plan, cannot anticipate the reversal that Esther's intervention will trigger. The narrative captures the volatility of human ambition and the consequences of overconfidence, showing that those who manipulate power for personal gain often sow the seeds of their own destruction. Meanwhile, Esther's careful navigation of the situation demonstrates the value of patience, timing, and ethical persuasion. The reversal of fortune in this segment is dramatic, even theatrical. Haman's execution, coupled with the empowerment of Mordecai and the Jewish community, serves as a narrative climax that resolves both personal and communal conflicts. The themes of justice, moral courage, and strategic action are brought to the forefront, illustrating that even in hierarchical and centralized empires, individuals could influence outcomes through intelligence, foresight, and bravery. Historians note that while the events may not be independently corroborated outside the biblical text, they reflect plausible social and political dynamics within the Persian Empire. Officials held significant influence, minority communities were vulnerable to abuse, and the king's favor could decisively shift fortunes. These elements contribute to a historically coherent framework within which the story of Haman's exposure unfolds. In conclusion, the exposure and execution of Haman mark a turning point in the Book of Esther. The narrative illustrates the consequences of unchecked ambition and hatred, the power of ethical and strategic intervention, and the potential for marginalized individuals to influence the course of history. It emphasizes that courage, wisdom, and moral integrity can overturn even the most threatening circumstances, transforming despair into triumph and vulnerability into empowerment. The dramatic reversal in Haman's fate not only secures the survival of the Jewish people, but also reinforces broader lessons about justice, power, and the capacity of individuals to act decisively within complex political systems. With Haman's downfall, the Persian Empire witnessed a dramatic reversal of fortune. The Jews, who had faced a decree calling for their annihilation, were now empowered to defend themselves. This moment in the Book of Esther represents not only the triumph of strategy and courage, but also the consolidation of communal identity and survival. The decree that Haman had orchestrated, which once threatened destruction, was effectively nullified. King Xerxes issued a new order permitting the Jews to defend their lives, their families, and their communities against any attackers. This change in fortune illustrates a broader theme within the narrative, that the moral courage and strategic intervention of individuals can influence the destiny of entire populations. The Jewish people, scattered across the vast Persian Empire, from Susa to distant provinces, were now positioned to act in their own defense. Letters were sent to every province, explaining the new decree and authorizing self-protection. These communications relied on the empire's extensive administrative system, demonstrating how Persian bureaucratic efficiency could be harnessed both for destruction and for protection. The Jews responded with unity and determination. When the appointed day arrived, they defended themselves vigorously against those who sought to harm them. Historical context suggests that communities in the Persian Empire often had some capacity to organize their own defense, particularly in regions distant from the imperial center. While the Book of Esther provides a narrative account, it aligns with what is known about the practical realities of empire. Local populations could mobilize in response to threats, and central decrees provided legal authority for action. The results were dramatic. The enemies of the Jews were defeated, and their communities were preserved. While scholars note that exact numbers and events are difficult to verify historically, the narrative emphasizes the strategic and ethical dimensions of communal survival. Mordecai, whose earlier loyalty to the king had positioned him as a figure of influence, played a key role in organizing and advising the Jewish people. His presence illustrates the importance of leadership within minority communities, particularly in times of crisis. By combining moral guidance with strategic planning, Mordecai helped the Jews navigate the complexities of life under Persian rule while ensuring their survival. The story also highlights the establishment of Purim, a festival that commemorates these events. The name Purim derives from the casting of lots, pur, that Haman used to determine the date of the Jews' intended destruction. With the reversal of fortune, this day was transformed into a celebration of survival, resilience, and the triumph of justice. Purim became a ritual of remembrance, fasting, feasting, and charitable giving, reinforcing communal bonds and the importance of moral vigilance. The festival also served to preserve the historical memory of the Jewish people, ensuring that future generations would understand the dangers faced by their ancestors and the significance of courage and ethical action in the face of existential threats. The Book of Esther presents this outcome as both a personal and collective victory. For Esther, it validated the risks she had taken to approach the king and revealed her capacity to influence outcomes within an empire that might otherwise have ignored the plight of her people. For Mordecai, it demonstrated the long-term value of loyalty, ethical action, and strategic patience. For the Jewish people as a whole, it ensured the preservation of life, faith, and community identity. From a historical perspective, the narrative resonates with patterns observed in large empires. Minority communities often faced vulnerabilities, particularly when confronted by ambitious or prejudiced officials. Survival required strategic leadership, alliances, and sometimes the courageous intervention of individuals with access to power. Esther's story captures these dynamics vividly, illustrating how influence, courage, and foresight can intersect to secure the future of a people. The celebrations of Purim are deeply symbolic. They commemorate not just survival, but also the principles that made that survival possible: ethical courage, strategic action, communal unity, and the moral use of influence. These themes are embedded within the rituals of the festival, including feasting, giving to the poor, and sharing gifts, which reinforce solidarity and collective memory. The narrative also underscores the unpredictability of fortune within the Persian Empire. Haman, who had once wielded immense power, was executed, while those previously vulnerable, like Esther and the Jewish population, were empowered. This reversal illustrates the fragility of authority based on arrogance, prejudice, or personal ambition, and conversely, the potential for ethical action and wise intervention to produce transformative outcomes. Scholars studying the Persian period note that while direct historical verification of the Book of Esther's events is limited, the narrative is consistent with known structures of imperial administration, social hierarchies, and the vulnerability of minority populations. The mechanisms of communication, legal authority, and bureaucratic efficiency described in the text align with historical knowledge of how decrees were issued, enforced, and recorded across the empire. The communal response to the threat also reflects practical realities. Jewish communities in exile maintained networks of communication, shared religious and cultural practices, and relied on trusted leaders to organize collective action when necessary. Mordecai and Esther's leadership exemplifies these historical patterns, highlighting the importance of capable individuals in preserving life, culture, and identity. The defeat of Haman's opponents and the defense of the Jewish people also illustrate the concept of moral and ethical justice in the narrative. Haman's personal vendetta had threatened an entire population, but the ethical courage of Esther, combined with strategic guidance from Mordecai, ensured that justice was achieved. This reflects a broader cultural principle that power, when exercised responsibly, can protect vulnerable communities and reinforce social cohesion. Beyond the immediate outcomes, the events described in the Book of Esther had long-lasting implications. The festival of Purim became a cornerstone of Jewish cultural and religious life, commemorating the preservation of a people in the face of annihilation. The rituals, storytelling, and communal activities associated with Purim reinforced the lessons of courage, ethical action, and the importance of vigilance against threats to identity and survival. The story also highlights the enduring relevance of strategic action in moments of crisis. Esther's careful planning, courage in the face of personal risk, and use of influence within the court provide a model for leadership under pressure. The narrative emphasizes that ethical considerations, foresight, and the willingness to act decisively are central to successful outcomes, particularly when lives and communities are at stake. The events of Purim also carry symbolic significance beyond the historical narrative. They represent the triumph of justice over malice, the importance of communal solidarity, and the enduring power of strategic ethical action. By celebrating these outcomes annually, Jewish communities not only honor their ancestors' survival, but also reaffirm their commitment to values that enable resilience, courage, and moral integrity. In addition, the Book of Esther situates these events within the broader framework of Persian imperial politics. The king's ability to issue and reverse decrees, the efficiency of the administrative apparatus, and the importance of personal influence all underscore the complex interplay of power, governance, and individual agency. Esther's successful intervention demonstrates how individuals, even those from marginalized communities, could navigate these structures to produce meaningful change. The narrative reinforces the concept that survival in hierarchical and centralized societies often depends on the combination of intelligence, courage, ethical judgment, and strategic action. It also highlights the delicate balance of relationships within the court, where influence, favor, and timing were crucial to achieving outcomes that aligned with moral and communal objectives. The establishment of Purim further emphasizes the importance of memory and commemoration in shaping collective identity. By transforming a day of potential tragedy into a festival of joy and gratitude, the Jewish people affirmed their resilience and the enduring significance of ethical action, strategic foresight, and community solidarity. This segment of the narrative, therefore, serves multiple functions. It resolves the immediate crisis posed by Haman, illustrates the consequences of unchecked ambition, highlights the effectiveness of strategic and ethical leadership, and establishes a cultural and religious legacy that continues to resonate over 2 millennia later. In conclusion, the Jewish victory and the institution of Purim represent not only the preservation of life, but also the affirmation of values that enable communities to thrive even in the face of existential threats. The combination of courage, strategic planning, and moral integrity, exemplified by Esther and Mordecai, ensured that the Jewish people survived and maintained their identity within the Persian Empire. As the Jewish people celebrated their deliverance and instituted the festival of Purim, the narrative set a precedent for remembering resilience, identity, and the ethical use of influence in times of crisis. Esther's story is remarkable not just because of the dramatic events it recounts, but because of the principles it embodies. The queen, a young Jewish woman raised by her cousin Mordecai after being orphaned, navigated the complexities of a vast empire where her survival depended on both personal discretion and strategic insight. Her ascent to the throne of Xerxes was, in itself, a remarkable achievement. In an empire as sprawling and hierarchical as Persia, queens were often selected for beauty and decorum, but true influence required intelligence, patience, and an understanding of court politics. Esther's ability to maintain her identity while integrating into the royal household demonstrates the delicate balance of assimilation and authenticity required for survival within foreign and powerful structures. Her story emphasizes that personal identity can be both a source of vulnerability and strength. By concealing her Jewish heritage initially, Esther protected herself, yet it was precisely her willingness to reveal that identity at a critical moment that enabled her to save her people. This tension between concealment and revelation illustrates a larger historical truth for minority populations within empires. Navigating social, cultural, and political pressures required adaptability, foresight, and moral courage. Mordecai, as a guardian and advisor, played a critical role in shaping Esther's decisions. His earlier acts of loyalty to the king, such as uncovering a plot to assassinate Xerxes, positioned him as a figure of influence and respect. This influence, combined with Esther's proximity to the king, created a unique intersection of personal courage and institutional leverage. The narrative demonstrates how strategic alliances, ethical guidance, and community solidarity are essential in moments of existential threat. Haman, the antagonist of the story, represents the dangers of unchecked ambition, personal vendetta, and prejudice. His plot to annihilate the Jewish people highlights the vulnerabilities faced by minority communities under centralized power structures. While the precise historicity of Haman's identity and actions is debated, the narrative reflects plausible patterns in imperial societies. Officials wielded authority that could both protect and endanger populations, and their personal motivations often had profound consequences. The dramatic reversal of fortune, in which Haman is executed and the Jews are empowered to defend themselves, underscores the fragility of power based solely on arrogance and cruelty. It also demonstrates the efficacy of ethical courage, strategic planning, and timely intervention. Esther's intervention at the critical banquet, her revelation to the king, and her careful orchestration of events illustrate how individuals can exercise agency even within rigid hierarchies. These actions had immediate consequences, but they also established a model for leadership under pressure. The combination of moral integrity, strategic thinking, and decisive action can alter the trajectory of events for entire communities. The Jewish victory and the establishment of Purim serve as enduring symbols of resilience and collective memory. Purim commemorates the survival of the Jewish people and the triumph of justice over oppression. Its rituals, including feasting, charity, and the reading of Esther's story, reinforce communal solidarity and the transmission of historical memory. By celebrating Purim, Jewish communities throughout history reaffirmed the principles of courage, ethical action, and the preservation of identity in the face of existential threats. The structures of the empire, the role of royal officials, the importance of communication and decrees, and the vulnerabilities of minority populations are consistent with what is known about the period from Persian inscriptions, administrative records, and archaeological evidence. This lends the narrative credibility as a reflection of lived realities, even if some events are dramatized or symbolic. The enduring appeal of Esther's story also lies in its human dimensions. Themes of courage, identity, loyalty, justice, and moral responsibility resonate across generations. Her actions illustrate that individuals, regardless of social status, can influence history through bravery, ethical judgment, and strategic insight. This narrative continues to inspire not only religious communities but also historians, scholars, and leaders who study the intersection of personal agency and systemic power. Furthermore, the story emphasizes the importance of timing and patience. Esther did not act impulsively. She prepared, sought counsel, and carefully orchestrated the sequence of events that would lead to the salvation of her people. This strategic patience, combined with moral clarity, is a central lesson. Effective intervention in high-stakes situations requires both preparation and courage. The Book of Esther also highlights the interconnectedness of personal actions and collective outcomes. Mordecai's loyalty, Haman's ambition, and Esther's courage were all interwoven, creating a chain of events that determined the fate of an entire population. The narrative illustrates that historical outcomes are rarely the result of isolated actions. They emerge from networks of relationships, ethical choices, and strategic decisions. In addition to its historical and moral dimensions, the story of Esther provides a cultural legacy. The annual celebration of Purim, with its rituals and readings, reinforces communal memory and identity. These traditions ensure that future generations understand the perils faced by their ancestors and the ethical principles that guided their survival. The narrative thereby functions as both history and moral instruction, bridging the past and the present. Esther's story also illuminates the role of women in leadership within historical contexts. While the Persian court was patriarchal, Esther's influence demonstrates that women could exert a profound impact through intelligence, strategy, and moral courage. Her actions challenge assumptions about power and agency, showing that even within restrictive systems, individuals can create meaningful change. Ultimately, the story of Esther is a testament to the resilience of human communities and the power of ethical action. Her courage in the face of existential threat, Mordecai's guidance, and the eventual survival of the Jewish people underscore the principles of justice, moral responsibility, and strategic intervention. These lessons, though ancient, continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of leadership, ethics, and communal identity. From a historical perspective, the narrative also provides insight into the dynamics of the Persian Empire. While some events may be embellished or symbolic, the depiction of royal authority, bureaucratic power, and the vulnerabilities of minority populations is consistent with scholarly understanding of the period. The story offers a window into the political, social, and cultural environment in which exiled Jewish communities lived, highlighting both risks and opportunities for influence within imperial structures. In conclusion, the legacy of Esther is multifaceted. It encompasses the survival of a people, the triumph of ethical courage over malice, the strategic exercise of influence, and the creation of enduring cultural practices. Her story demonstrates that individuals, even those from marginalized communities, can shape history through moral clarity, strategic action, and the courage to act when the stakes are highest. The celebration of Purim ensures that these lessons are remembered, transmitted, and honored across generations. The narrative of Esther remains a timeless account of resilience, leadership, and the enduring power of ethical and strategic action in the face of existential threats. It reminds us that the intersection of courage, intelligence, and moral responsibility can transform despair into triumph, leaving an enduring legacy for both individuals and communities throughout history.